And the first talker is Sophie from Swansea University, who did a PhD on revegetation post-invasive species control.
Hi everyone. I think we're scrolling back to my first slide now, so you've all gotten a sneak peek at some of the results. So yeah, I'm Sophie. I'm currently lecturing at Swansea University, but I did my PhD on Japanese knotweed, the kind of sustainability around that. So what are sustainable methods of knotweed management, and what happens after you manage to control the knotweed? How do we actually restore that habitat? So my research focuses on the benefits and the disadvantages of passive versus active restoration, how we recover the plant community, and like I said, the sustainability of knotweed management. So today I'm going to be talking about how we actually integrate revegetation into our invasive weed management. So I think we've already kind of understood from the talks this morning that invasive species is a human problem. So the species that get introduced to the UK and well, all parts of the world, they are specifically chosen by us. So there's some sort of bias in the way that these species are introduced. And that kind of biases the invasiveness of these species, okay? So they all have different traits that relate to their invasiveness. And that kind of gives us a lot of different opportunities for management methods. So each different species has a different ecology, a different biology, and so we can't just have this kind of one-size-fits-all approach to management. And there is a continual increase in the number of invasive species over time. So invasive species management is really important. I'm sure we all know that. As Mark just very eloquently described, invasive species management is more than just target species removal. And what we've observed from our studies is that when you control Japanese knotweed, oftentimes you get either reinvasion, so it'll just come back again, or you get secondary invasion with other invaders. A lot of the time that would be Himalayan balsam. And what happens is once you control the Himalayan balsam, you end up with a lot of the time degraded land that can't really sustain a native plant community. So while we may have a good understanding of how we control some of these invasive species, what comes after that is still almost a big question mark. So we really need to start thinking long-term in invasive plant management, and I know that term's been kind of bounced around a lot today, but there's two main reasons for this. So the first reason is that eradication is not always viable for our invasive plants. For example, Japanese knotweed, you can't actually eradicate it. So it takes about 5 years to achieve reasonable control. But even then, you would need continual management after that. But also, invasive plants are living things. They are part of complex biological systems. And so by shifting focus from just the target species to the entire habitat, we can actually try and create more sustainable management approaches and restore habitats afterwards as well. So invasive weed management is a long-term process, and it requires the right combination of different factors. So obviously we need to have clear management goals and outcomes. We need to hopefully have effective and sustainable control approaches and some sort of consideration of mitigation or restoration measures after that. All of these rely on an understanding of target species biology and ecology, and they're all interlinked, as you can see by the many, many arrows here. So if we want to try and foster ecological recovery and maybe improve biodiversity gains, we need to be considering the wider ecology of our invaded habitats. So what I think we need to do is just consider invasive plant management as one stage of a wider restoration program. So restoration is any activity that kind of assists in the recovery of a habitat or ecosystem. So invasive plant control and revegetation, these are both active kind of restoration measures. But the important thing is that effective control has to happen before we can even consider revegetation. And these are just some key considerations that we need to think about before we start integrating revegetation into our management plans. And I've just noticed that some of the text is overhanging there. I don't know what's happened there. But anyway, key considerations. So we need to manage as a habitat or an ecosystem. We need to make sure that we've got our target species controlled down first. So that means employing the correct methods, aligning that with species biology. We need to set up regular monitoring and have realistic expectations of the land use. So what happens after we control our invasive species? Eradication is not always likely, so we need to kind of make sure that our expectations are realistic. And obviously all of this comes with financial constraints as well. So these are some of the key steps that I would argue are really important if we're trying to integrate revegetation into our management programs. Really important that we first need to identify our starting point. We need to know what it is we're starting off with, what invasive species that we're dealing with. Are there any clues in that habitat that can tell us what might happen after we control the invasive species? That will also help us identify our management outcomes and set realistic targets and measurable indicators. Choose an effective control method, evaluate control success, and then plan and implement revegetation if needed. Okay. So, when we're identifying our starting point, and obviously if you're a practitioner, you'll be going out and doing your risk assessments and things like that. So we obviously need to know what kind of invasive species we have present here. It's also really useful to know how the land is currently used. So is it private land? Is it being used for anything? You know, are there any kind of other sources of disturbance going on there that might influence our management? What's the state of the current habitat? So what's likely to grow once the invasive weeds are controlled? Is there a sufficient seed bank, or has it been a very long established invasion that might require further help? And then, like I said, any other sources of disturbance or sources of invasive plants which may kind of add complications into our management. So really what I'm trying to get across here is that, as well as a risk assessment, it's really useful to kind of include some baseline or habitat use inventory, so we know what we're starting off with. Once we know where we are, we need to find out where we're going to go. So we need to know what our end goal is. And there are, again, multiple different factors that might influence our management objectives. They include land ownership, land use objectives. So are we managing knotweed on amenity grassland, for example? And the outcomes are going to be very different to if we're looking at a semi-natural habitat or a triple SI. Sometimes historic records of land use and habitat type can give us some clues and help us in that. But also stakeholder needs need to be considered in there as well. And the really important thing is to make sure that we align in this with our management priorities and our budget, and this will allow us to set achievable goals. And if we look at how restoration projects are planned in the literature, so this is kind of taken from some of the guidance by Pratch et al. So they do a lot of work with the Society for Ecological Restoration. And it kind of follows the same format. So we need to identify our end goal, which will be our restored habitat. So maybe we want to use a reference ecosystem, so we know that there's habitat nearby that maybe we want to kind of attain in our management. Or we could also use some historic habitat information. Identify our targets, so these are ideal habitat characteristics. So for example, this could be reduced invasive plant cover and abundance, and we want increased native plant abundance or diversity, or whatever it is that we want to achieve. And then we need specific measurable indicators that will allow us to evaluate our management success. So this really involves identifying thresholds for invasive plant density and cover. It might be comparing similarities to our plant community and reference sites. It might be that we have a specific dominant functional type that we're interested in, so we want to restore this to a grassland, in which case grasses are going to be really important there. Or if you want to be more involved, and this may be more relevant for semi-natural habitats and triple SIs and things like that, you might want to actually identify a community that you want to achieve, in which case you may need some sort of help with ecological planning. Okay, so once we've identified our goals and we've got our targets, obviously we need to choose appropriate control methods, and I know we've had a lot of discussion about this today already, but I just want to reiterate again that following evidence-led best practice is really, really important. So good management needs the right herbicide or the right approach the right timing and the right application method. And really, this should be aligned with target species biology. So I've just got some examples here of work that I've been involved with or have been adjacent to, looking at how the biology of our target species actually lends itself to management in an effective way. And when we're thinking about how we manage our invasive plants, it's really important to think about sustainability as well. So we've had a lot of talk about carbon emissions, and I know we had a really nice talk this morning about life cycle analysis in pavement weed control, which is great. Often, and this is based on research that I've completed as part of my PhD, which is hopefully what's under review, but often the most effective method is the most sustainable. And the reason for that is that the less products that we can use, the less impact that has, okay? So the more effective something is, the less you would need to put into that system, and therefore the less impact you have. So that saves you time, it saves you money, and a lot of stress in the long run. And then once we've implemented our management program, and obviously this takes a long time, so we've been banging on about long term. Like I said, in the case of Japanese knotweed, that means at least 5 years, I would say. So this does take a very long time, but there needs to be some sort of evaluation of control success. So we need to be revisiting and monitoring what our invasive species are doing. Do they align with the indicators that we've set out? We need to be monitoring what other species turn up. So are we getting secondary invasion of Himalayan balsam or any other thing? Are we getting kind of recolonization of native species? And if we are getting secondary invasion, that needs to kind of feed back into our management approach. So we may need to reevaluate our control approach and adjust as necessary as the kind of dominant invasive species changes as we move through our program. It's really also important to monitor the impacts of control. So if we are going to be using herbicides to treat a large area of Japanese knotweed, for example, what are the impacts of that? It might be that you get spray drift into a really ancient oak tree, that needs to be mitigated somehow. Or it might just be that this invasion has been around for such a long time that we have a really depleted seed bank and something else needs to be done about it. So it's only after we've done all of that that we are able to start thinking about how we integrate that with revegetation. The timing of revegetation or restoration is informed by monitoring, so that's why monitoring is so important. Natural regeneration is sometimes possible. For example, in small-scale invasion, you may get just natural recolonization of local species, in which case you don't need to worry about restoring or revegetating habitats. But further monitoring would be recommended in those cases. And for long-established invasions, then that's when you would really need to consider active restoration. And revegetation is just one type of active restoration method. So in the context of invasive plants, this is kind of a relatively new field of applied ecological research. I'm just going to go through some of the important things about revegetation in a moment. So this was a large chunk of my PhD research, was looking at how we restore habitats. So I don't know if anyone's heard about our site down in Taft's Well. It was basically started off as a monoculture of Japanese knotweed. Dan Jones did extensive work testing different control measures there, and then it was my job to come in and kind of test how we restore habitats afterwards. Seed mixes were used, so that was with the help of ICL, thank you very much for that. I looked at the different functional traits of the seed mixes that we could use and how we could integrate that with other materials, for example, geotextile covering, and whether there was scope to integrate this with herbicide application or spot treatment of Japanese knotweed. And going back to my point that sometimes you may not actually need to revegetate an area, it's the simple fact that just by controlling your target species, a lot of the time your native species diversity will increase. So for example, this is a detrended correspondence analysis plot. I don't know if anyone knows about that, but it's basically showing community structure in a plant community. This is an untreated control, and we can see that we've only got 2 species there, Japanese knotweed and bindweed. And just by treating our knotweed with herbicides, we do get an increase in the number of species that we find. But if you do want to go down the route of revegetation, it can sometimes suppress invasive plants and enhance biodiversity. In terms of Japanese knotweed, from my research, that wasn't the case. Functional traits were useful, but not in suppressing Japanese knotweed. And the main reason for that is because Japanese knotweed has these huge energy stores below ground, and nothing that you can add to it in the form of a seed mix is going to outcompete with that. However, seed mixes can be tailored to outcompete or suppress other species. For example, Himalayan balsam. Traits aren't always as important as seed density, so the amount of material that you kind of use to outcompete those plants is more important. Increase in seed density can also improve establishment of the new community that you're trying to restore. And geotextiles, again, don't enhance knotweed suppression, but can improve native species abundance. They can also suppress the seed banks. That might be important for seed-borne species like Himalayan balsam in the short term. But obviously there needs to be some sort of catchment scale management there if you're going to look at any long-term suppression. Anecdotally as well, geotextiles are really good at stabilising soil, which we found out after an unprecedented flood at our study site. Okay, so some of the practicalities about revegetation. The species that you need to use will depend on your restoration goal and the goal for land use. So if you're just restoring something to an amenity site or a parkland, then you could use potentially just some kind of generic seed mix that includes grasses. But obviously if you've got semi-natural habitats or any kind of ideas around specific habitat generation, then that's not going to be so simple. A lot of the time you will see seed mixes being talked about in this context. Seeds are often more affordable and quicker to implement, which is great, but they do have a lower establishment success. Plugs and trees often have greater establishment success, but they can be more expensive and more time consuming to plant, and obviously more labour intensive as well. So really it depends on the timeline of your project, your budget, and the stakeholder needs and your end goal. Ideally, you want to be using local plants and consult local ecologists where possible. Local plants are better adapted and more sustainable. You cut out on carbon emissions through the generation of plants and harvesting of those things and transport and things like that. So local plants are usually the best option to go with. And then obviously the timing of revegetation is going to be influenced by what species that you're reintroducing, whether they're plants or plugs or seeds, and weather conditions will impact your seedling establishment as well. Sources of disturbance are also a key factor in influencing outcomes. So that's going to be sources of other invasive plants, so things like rivers, railway lines, fly tipping. So this needs to be coordinated on a kind of a large scale. And then other disturbances as well, like flooding, salt spray, and traffic, will all influence the establishment success of your project. Mainly, conditions are largely informed by your management and restoration goal, expectations around land use, your budget, your time and your labour constraints, stakeholder involvement, whether they have any ideas around what they would like the outcome of the project to be, and also socio-economic context may influence some of your outcomes as well on a geographical scale. The other thing I wanted to add here is that obviously the kind of area that you're wanting to restore is going to determine what methods you use. So for example, if you're looking to revegetate road verges or roadsides, a lot of the time you're going to want to go with something that's kind of a species poor mix that sometimes may need to involve some sort of topsoil replacement in there. But it depends on so many different things in a large context that it's difficult to kind of pin down in one 20-minute talk. So to summarize, this is how I would go about integrating restoration into a wider management program. So you need to have a good understanding of where you're starting off, what your goals and your targets are, have some long-term management in place first that is monitored regularly, and only then can you think about integrating with active restoration. So all of this requires considerations of sustainability, clear goals around your management, think about how you're going to monitor the impacts of management itself as well, and whether any mitigation measures are needed in there, and then some sort of understanding of species biology and ecology is important to all of that. Okay, that's me done.